In a time when the moon looked thin and hungry too, there lived a woodcutter who had two children, Hansel, whose pockets were always full of pebbles, and Gretel, who had eyes like bright buttons and a mind like a steel trap. Their stepmother, oh, she was a piece of work, decided that two less mouths to feed meant 2 more weeks of gruel for her. She whispered to their father beneath the thatch, suggesting a picnic in the deep woods from which no child returns. The father, poor soggy fool, wept into his beard, but agreed. Children, after all, are so very edible when resources run thin. But Hansel had been listening through the keyhole, as children do when they suspect they're on the menu that night. When the house snored in harmony, he crept out to fill his pockets with moon-white pebbles that gleamed like dropped teeth in the dark. "What are you doing?" whispered Gretel, sitting up in bed. "Leaving a trail," he grinned, "so we can find our way back to that miserable shack we call home." There is nothing quite so optimistic as a child preparing for their own abandonment. Come morning, the stepmother herded them into the forest with smiles sharp as broken glass. "Gather mushrooms," she sang, "and don't come back until your baskets overflow." The children walked until the trees grew thick and the path forgot its own name. When the noon sun stood overhead like a watchful eye, their father and stepmother vanished like bad dreams. The birds, however, were hungry too, and they feasted on Hansel's breadcrumbs until the trail was nothing but a rumor. "Well," said Gretel, adjusting her apron, "that's inconvenient." They wandered for days that felt like years, until their stomachs began to sing songs of protest. Then, oh, then they saw it, a house made entirely of confectionery architecture, standing in a clearing like a sugar-high fever dream. The roof was cake, the walls were gingerbread, the windows were spun sugar catching the light like stained glass. "It's a trick," whispered Hansel, but his mouth was already watering. "Everything is a trick," said Gretel, "but I'm starving, and that window looks delicious." She took a bite. It crunched like a promise. The door creaked open, don't they always? And out stepped an old woman leaning on a cane of bone. She wore a dress the color of dried blood and smiled with teeth that seemed borrowed from someone younger. "Oh, my pretty darlings," she cooed. Come in. I shall feed you pancakes and milk and tuck you into feather beds." Her eyes, however, were calculating the meat on their bones like a butcher at market. But the children, poor lambs, followed her inside, because hospitality is difficult to refuse when you're halfway to starving. Morning brought not pancakes, but imprisonment. Hansel found himself in a cage of iron bars hung in the pantry like a ham. The old woman, who was, of course, a witch of the culinary variety, wanted him plump and tender. "Eat little bone," she commanded, shoving bread through the bars. "I need you marbled, not lean." Gretel was put to work as a scullery maid, scrubbing floors and stirring cauldrons, while her brother grew fatter by the day. "How do I look?" Hansel would ask. "Like a pork roast," Gretel would reply. "Excellent," he'd say, and eat another slice. The witch had an oven, as witches do. It was large enough to roast a child, which was convenient, as that was precisely her dinner plan. "Gretel, my dear," she said one morning, her voice sticky as treacle, "climb inside and check if the oven is hot enough for the bread." Now, Gretel was many things, hungry, tired, and absolutely not stupid. She suspected the bread was a metaphor and the oven was waiting for her bones to season it. "I don't know how," she said, playing the innocent. "The opening is too narrow for my poor head." "Like this, you foolish girl." The witch snapped and thrust her head and shoulders into the oven to demonstrate proper temperature checking technique. It was, you must understand, the moment Gretel had been waiting for with a strength born of desperation and sibling loyalty. She planted both hands on the witch's rump and pushed. The witch went tumbling into the flames with a shriek like a kettle boiling over. Gretel slammed the iron door and turned the latch. "Bake until golden brown," she muttered, and went to find the cage key. Some recipes are best served burnt. Hansel emerged from the cage, thinner than planned, but alive, which was the important thing. They held each other for a moment, two children who had out-cannibaled the cannibal. Then practicality set in. "She must have treasure," said Hansel, wiping crumbs from his shirt. "They always do." And indeed, in the witch's trunk, they found pearls and gold coins mixed with strange herbs and bottles of things that bubbled. Gretel filled her apron with the wealth. "For our trouble," she said, "and for the therapy we'll surely need," added Hansel, ever the pragmatist. But they still had to cross the river to get home, and the water was wide and wicked, full of currents that liked the taste of children. As they stood on the bank, a white swan glided up, though whether it was enchanted or merely accommodating, who can say? "Climb on my back," it seemed to say, or perhaps it honked. Either way, the children understood. They climbed aboard, and the swan ferried them across, because even in the darkest tales, sometimes the wildlife remembers to be helpful when you've just incinerated a witch. When they reached their father's cottage, things were not as they had left them. The stepmother had died of what the stories vary, but let's assume it was something ironic and unpleasant involving gruel. Their father sat on the stoop, thinner than thread, weeping into hands that had once abandoned them. He looked up to see two children glowing with pearls and strange prosperity. "We brought you treasures," said Gretel, "but also trust issues." The father wept anew, but this time with relief and shame, which is a different flavor of salt entirely. They lived well after that, as people do when they've stolen a witch's fortune. But they never forgot the taste of gingerbread or the heat of that oven. Hansel would wake sometimes, checking his pockets for pebbles that were no longer there. Gretel would stare into fireplaces with a knowing smile. They had learned that the world is a hungry place, full of candy houses and sharp-toothed smiles, and that survival sometimes requires pushing unpleasant things into flames. It is not the lesson one hopes for children, but it is the lesson they got. And so, dear listener, if you ever find yourself in a forest deep and dark and you see a house made of sweets, remember, not all sugar is kindness and not all ovens are for bread. Bring pebbles, bring wit, and bring a sister with strong arms, for the world is full of witches who see children as ingredients, and sometimes the only way out is through the fire. Now sleep tight and mind your crumbs. The end.